This is the story of American freedom. And thus the glorious Fourth. Today, there are many in our society, perhaps our society as a whole, which rejects the very idea of putting God, nature's God, the law of God, into a discussion within our public life, within our politics. There are others who say we have passed far beyond the values of the founders. There are others who see these very values as wrong, condemning the founders as hypocrites, speaking of an unalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, while some of them were slave owners. You could try to explain, talk about the law of nature, what it really meant, how it was studied in their schools, was the very basis of their moral training, how it rests upon the idea that only God is perfect, and only in the realm of God can all men be free and equal. The law of humanity, the law of the individual nations, that's different. And every nation, every society has had to deal with slavery. But that is of no use. The values of the founders were simply wrong, or we've progressed beyond them. And 4th of July, why, it has turned into one giant sales event, hasn't it? Time to buy a new automobile, a new boat, go get some new shoes. Yes, yes indeed. Have a barbecue. Hard to go back to the days immediately following the 4th of July in 1776, when newspapers carried its words all over the colonies, now independent states, rapidly, to cheering crowds hearing it from the State House in Boston. And there is no more moving, no more evocative picture in all of American history than of George Washington with his tears streaming down his face, reading the Declaration of Independence to his soldiers. They too weeping as they understood the noble reasons for which they were fighting this great struggle. But by the end of that year, 1776, that momentous year, things were very gloomy. And it looked as though this Declaration of Independence, with all of its touching and brilliant language, was about to go into the dustbin of history. For the British were far on their way to conquering the colonies and to putting down this revolution. Britain did not take this matter lightly. It sent forth the largest armada of ships it had ever sent forth before, including 73 warships and hundreds of transports, 42,000 crack troops were in the colonies, and alongside them many loyalist American colonists who fought for the king and his Native American allies. The strategy of the British was clear. The central colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, these were to be conquered first, separating the southern colonies from New England, the hotbed of the Revolution. There were many loyalists, many strong supporters of the king in New York, in Philadelphia. And it was there the British made their first strike. And the American army under George Washington did not distinguish itself. The British had evacuated Boston, but on the heights of Harlem in New York, the Americans, trained in warfare, but not equal to the British in a stand-up battle, found themselves badly beaten. They were driven in complete disarray from New York. George Washington completely outgeneraled by the British and driven on down into New Jersey. And there the British made a clean sweep, conquering New Jersey, driving its legislature into flight. Now, many of the soldiers fighting for King George were Germans. That was a common practice in the time. You hired foreign troops. And Germany was not the united country we know today. It was rather a country made up of dozens and dozens of small and large principalities. And some of these, like Hesse, their duke made his living primarily by renting out his soldiers. He kept, for the size of his little principality, a large army, highly trained, top flight. And whenever someone needed troops, he was glad to rent them out. Now, it is interesting that one of the absolute despots of the age, Catherine the Great of Russia, refused to sell any of her men to King George. She would not put down a free people rising up for their rights. But the Duke of Hesse and others didn't have any such qualms. And so many of these came from Hesse that they were given the general name of Hessians, these German troops. And they were in the British troops that marched down through New Jersey, carrying with them a declaration that you had to sign, swearing your allegiance to King George, or they'd burn your house over your head. Well, you know, if they burned your house over your head, that was pretty serious business. You couldn't use your credit card to go down to the Walmart and buy some food for your family. That was your crop for the year. There was no insurance company to rebuild your house. It was gone. Your family faced starvation. And your wife urged you, sign that declaration. Let's not get our house burned down. This cause is already lost. And so you wondered, you thought. And many of these Hessians spoke no English whatever. So there was this officer with great high boots standing in front of you saying, Schreiben Sie unter, schreiben Sie unter. And you said, I don't understand German. Schreiben Sie unter. All right. Brennen, abbrennen, burn it down. Oh, okay, there it went. And you fled into hiding. And thus New Jersey was cleared, and Washington's army driven out. He, with his army, small and dwindling, fled over into Pennsylvania. And there we find him on December the 25th, 1776. He has written to his brother 7 days before, saying, unless something miraculous occurs, I think the game is pretty much up. But Washington knew that you make your own miracles. His army was small and getting smaller. He had with him 2,200 Continental troops. These were regular army men. They were still not trained to the level of a British soldier, but they were a regular standing army. And then he had with him about 2,000 more militia troops. Now, these were notoriously unreliable. They didn't see themselves as that way. Now, every colony had a militia law, and that is, as I told you, every man from age 16 up to my age and beyond was responsible for being part of the militia could be called up. If he couldn't provide weapons for himself, they were provided. There was regular drill. And these militias signed on for a particular period of time. And they might sign on for 3 months. And they were as good as their word. They stayed for 3 months, but then when the 3 months were up, they went home. And a number of these were going to go home on January the 1st. Washington pondered. What could he do? Well, he had them until January the 1st. Washington liked to use spies. He made very good use of them. Many merchants went in and out of the British military camps, selling goods, selling beef, wheat, other necessities. And they reported to Washington that the British had gone into winter quarters. The British commander had a mistress in Philadelphia that he was devoted to. There were lots of parties going on. And why should he interrupt the gaiety of the Christmas season to take this unnecessary task? Washington's army was going to fall apart anyway. So they had gone into winter quarters. And about 1,000 of them were in winter quarters in Trenton, New Jersey. These were all Hessians under the command of Johann Gottlieb von Rahl. And they had their snug little cabins, comfortable. And Washington learned a little bit about German Christmas. And that is to say, the Germans celebrate, still today, 2 Christmases. The 25th, which is for your family, and the 26th, which is for your friends. But these Hessians, having neither family nor friends, saw this as at least 2 days to stay dead drunk. So there they were, dead drunk. Not expecting in the least that they would be attacked. It was bad weather. It had been snowing. The Americans were on the other side of the Delaware River. And so Washington began to calculate his chances. And that evening, making use of barges, which normally carried wheat up and down the river, poled by some of his favorite soldiers, his Marblehead men from Massachusetts. Washington had come to have the highest regard for Americans from all over the 13 states. Now, these were fishermen. They still wore their little fisherman caps and their little pea jackets and their wide-bottom pants. They had been the rear guard that kept Washington's army alive as it was driven from the heights of New York. And now they were there to pole across the river. Washington's army was loaded into these barges and began to push out. Ice flows in the river, sleet beginning to pour down, turning increasingly into a blizzard. But they made their way across and landed 18 miles from where the British Hessians were in winter quarters and began the march. Now it was snowing, and I don't know, I sometimes lead study trips, and you can't keep a group of 10 people in line. They wander off to get ice cream and things like that. So these troops started wandering off to get ice cream and things. And suddenly Washington was a great big man, about 6'4", and he used a soldier's language. Now don't get mad at me, I'm sorry. But he grabbed one of them and said, "God damn you to hell. You stand by your officer." And that soldier did. And they began to make their way. With them they had brought cannons. Pushed along, 18 of them. Their commanding artillery officer Henry Knox. Wore glasses. Just a few months before, he had been a bookseller in Boston. Now he was commanding these cannons, now getting them down this icy, snow-blinding roads. And the troops marched, and the cannons rolled, and they went all the way into Trenton itself. As dawn was breaking, the best shooters were put up in the top floors of the houses. The cannons were posted at either end of the main street, directed at the Hessian headquarters, and suddenly they began to fire. Boom, boom, boom. And the Hessians, staggering out of bed, their commanding officer so drunk that he thought this was a Christmas celebration and these were fireworks. So he ordered the band to strike up some Christmas carols and was promptly shot dead. Most of the Hessians didn't wait that long. They threw up their hands and surrendered. About 947 of them. And they were paroled, that is to say, they were given their word not to fight again, and they slipped off into small towns. Become part of America. Towns like King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, Germantown, Pennsylvania. The victory had been won. And Washington wasn't going to stop there. The British were learning to call him that old gray fox, and they knew he was a fighter, and he came on after them. Lord Cornwallis, commanding a force south of Princeton, began to march northward, learning of this serious British defeat. And Washington went right after him. And there at Princeton they came together. And the Americans again beat the British. You can still go to old Nassau Hall there in Princeton and see the bullet marks. There was a statue of King George whose head was shot off. And as the British ran, Washington yelled to his boys, "Get after them, boys. It's a bully fine fox hunt. Beat 'em up, boys. Beat 'em up good." And suddenly, all had changed. The Americans had won these victories, and the light of freedom flared up brighter than ever. Why? One, because of the bravery of these American soldiers, called upon to do what seemed impossible to the better trained troops of King George, but also because of their courage and patriotism. Don't let anybody tell you that the founders were a small group of men. The real founders of this country were the ordinary men and women who underwent every form of hardship, carried the revolution on their bayonet for 8 long years. But Washington was also a great general. I ask you, who was the greatest general in American history? Answer is simple: George Washington. Because without George Washington, there wouldn't have been any American history. He did what a general must do, win. And he won the most important war in our country's history. Thus 1777 dawned. The struggle would go on. The shift now was to New England. And General John Burgoyne, going back to London, using all of his influence to get command of a bold operation of converging columns coming down by Fort Ticonderoga, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies, would come to absolute grief in September of that year at Saratoga. And another great American victory was won, and the Americans again displayed their skill in fortification, artillery, sharpshooters. Daniel Morgan came from nowhere, never talked about his youth, but had once been sentenced to some 500 lashes during the French and Indian War for smashing an English officer in the face. But somehow in the counting, the officer got bored and went 398, 399, 400, 402, 403. But Daniel Morgan didn't forget. And whenever he went into battle, he yelled, "I'm coming for that other stripe, Georgie." He raised a group of marksmen, deadly in their fire. And there too at Saratoga was Benedict Arnold. He felt he had won the battle, and with some good reason. But he didn't get the promotion he wanted. And urged by his wife that he had been ill-treated, dishonored, he would go on and try to give plans to the British, betray his country. Washington admired him and thought highly of him. He betrayed his country, expecting a big promotion from the British, but a man who would betray even a rebellious nation could not win their trust. So he died in dishonor. But Saratoga, that was brought as news to the court of King Louis. There was Benjamin Franklin pleading the American cause. Gallant with the ladies. I don't know why he shouldn't be. He wasn't married. Wearing a wild-looking coonskin hat. Parading as a rustic when in fact he spoke beautiful French. Was familiar with French literature and French philosophy. And Louis had just been looking for an excuse to humble Britain, to gain back Canada. And so he agreed to supply first what was most important, money, and then troops. Well, the British had failed in New England, they'd failed in the middle colonies, but once again the generals had all the answers. So they went to King George and said, what we need to do is strike at the southern colonies. That's where you have so many loyal friends. They will rise up. And so the order went out to officers like Patrick Ferguson and Lord Cornwallis to strike with all possible fury at the backwoods of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, capturing port towns like Savannah and Charleston, and break the rebellion there in the South. Well, Savannah and Charleston were captured. And then under Ferguson, and then later Cornwallis, the British troops, still resplendent in their red outfits, went out to break the fiber of these frontier towns, hamlets. Farmers would come in on Sunday to hear fiery sermons from their preachers about the cause of liberty. And so on the Sunday, they heard the proclamation of Patrick Ferguson that either every head of household sign this declaration of allegiance or their farms would be burned to the ground. And the preachers said, what are you going to do about it? And the wives said, what are you going to do about it? And the men went out into the churchyard and said, let's just settle this damn thing once and for all. So they rode off 1,000 strong to King's Mountain. And there, storming the British on the heights, defeated an excellent British army, made them lay down their weapons, and then discovered, listening to them talk, that they weren't British at all. And they went up and looked at their little lapels and said, what is this 69 RNJ? Royal New Jersey? You're Americans coming down here to fight Americans? We've never been up there to New Jersey. We're going to teach you not to come down here and mess with us again. So they slit their noses, cut their ears off. When the ears began to smell as they were rotting, they smoked them like a ham. They wanted to hang them all, but finally they were convinced by their commander, John Sevier, later governor of Tennessee, just to hang 10 of them. And then on to Cowpens in South Carolina, where the Americans proved the brilliance of their strategy under Daniel Morgan. And then on to Guilford Courthouse, where Washington's favorite general, General Nathanael Greene, inflicted a defeat upon the British. Even though they could claim they had held the field, they were driven back, all the way back to Virginia, all the way back looking for supplies to a place called Yorktown. Washington got the word in late August that the British had retreated to Yorktown. And with 8,000 American troops, 7,000 French troops, he began the march towards Jamestown. The key to the British position was that Yorktown was on the ocean, and the British fleet dominated the sea. But, breaking his orders, the French Admiral de Grasse, who stood 6'2" normally and 6'10" when he was fighting a battle, his men said, sailed up from the West Indies. And one of the few times in their history, the British fleet was defeated and driven from the bay at Yorktown. And then Washington arrived, and he found waiting for him 8,000 American militiamen, Virginia militiamen. And with the aid of the French, the great French naval guns were dragged ashore. The bombardment of the British fort began. Redoubt, small fort after small fort of the British was captured. Finally, only 2 remained, the 9th and 10th. And Alexander Hamilton, serving on Washington's staff, asked for special permission to lead the charge that would capture that last remaining British outpost. It was captured. The great siege guns brought up to a position so close that the British fortifications could not withstand them. And on October the 17th, a little British drummer boy, 14 years old, stood on the parapet and beat out rum-pum, rum-pum, pum 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 pum. Parley, let's talk. And so Washington's delegate and Lord Cornwallis's delegate carried out the negotiations. They were short. Washington's orders were quite clear. There will be a total surrender without honors of war. That's unthinkable. We have, the British said, to have reserved the right, the honor of war, to march out under our colors. No, Washington said, you left hundreds of our men to starve on prison ships in Charleston and Savannah Harbor. You declared they weren't soldiers. Cornwallis said, I can't possibly sign this thing. His aide said, Your Lordship, I don't see that we have any choice. He tried to write to Washington. Washington wrote back and said, Your Lordship, I have made clear the terms. If you do not sign immediately, I am prepared to move upon your works. Your most obedient and humble servant, Washington. Cornwallis said, as he signed it, His Majesty is going to be most annoyed at this. And so His Majesty was. He rushed into his wife's bedroom shouting, It's lost. I've lost everything. I've thrown it all away. Some years later, when John Adams was our ambassador to London, he was making a speech to the king, and the king broke down in tears that his stupidity and willfulness had cost him such admirable subjects. But so it was. On the field at Yorktown, the British troops laid down their arms, and a new nation had been secured.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our Freedom and Heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.